Hi everyone, welcome back. This is video 3 for this week, and we're going to talk about epistemic injustice. So, epistemic injustice is a kind of error. It's both a moral error, it's a morally bad thing, and it's also an epistemological error, meaning it's a mistake involving beliefs, knowledge and beliefs. So, when I say it's a moral error, I mean it hurts other people, it's morally bad. But it also makes you less likely to have true beliefs. When we commit epistemic injustice, we are less likely to have true beliefs. We discount reliable information, or in some cases, maybe trust unreliable information. Epistemic injustice is a kind of wrong. It's a wrong done to someone as a knower, or as a person who knows information, or as a source of knowledge. So when you don't listen to someone you ought to listen to, that can be a form of epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice happens when an unjustified prejudice causes you to unfairly judge that someone doesn't have the knowledge, expertise, or information that they actually have. So when unjustified prejudice causes you to ignore someone's claims, even if they're a reliable source, that's epistemic injustice. You've wronged them in some way and effectively wronged yourself. So, I said it's about prejudice. Some of you may be thinking, but I don't have prejudices. I'm not prejudiced. I'm not a bigot, etc. Great. And that may well be true. Probably is, at least partially. You may not have any conscious prejudices. A conscious prejudice is a prejudiced belief or a bigoted belief that you know that you have, that you're aware of. Like how members of the KKK are explicitly racist. They believe that white people are better. They will tell you that they believe that. They know that they believe that. They consciously are aware and believe and endorse the view that white people are superior somehow. That's a conscious prejudice. It's an explicit bias. They are biased against people of color, people who are not white. And they know it. It's explicit. It's conscious in their mind. But there are also unconscious prejudices or implicit biases. Prejudices that we have, but we don't know that we have. Psychology and cognitive science research of the last several decades has provided a lot of strong evidence that we all have some implicit biases. We all have internal prejudices that we are not aware of, that they influence our decision making, and we don't realize that they're influencing our decision making. Cognitive science has suggested that our own explanations for why we did things and why we believe things is very rarely true, which is kind of scary, but kind of neat. It's very rarely true. It's a rationalization we come up with after the fact. We're not actually aware most of the time of why we're really doing the things we do and believing the things we believe. Our decisions are influenced by these prejudices, and we don't even know that we have them or that they're influencing our behavior. And that's frightening, right? You would like to think that you're in control of your own decisions and your own beliefs and that you know what's going on in your mind. But the fact is, you don't. We don't. That's not how the brain works, which is scary, but is true. There's a website that I encourage you all to visit, implicit.harvard.edu. It's a group at Harvard that studies implicit biases and has a variety of implicit attitude tests that you can take to check for biases. And it'll tell you, or it'll give you some indication of, to what degree, if any, some sort of bias is influencing your decision. They have ones for racial bias, for gender bias, for age bias, all kinds of different biases, religion bias. And so I encourage you to visit this website and take one or two of the tests. You may be surprised with the results. It may tell you you have no bias. It may tell you have a strong bias. It may tell you have a slight bias. You may be surprised. But it's worth taking, I think, to look just to see. And I think it's a good idea to try to be aware of what biases we may or may not have so we can try to counteract them and minimize their effects on our decisions. So, an important point I want to make here, uh, the evidence suggests that everyone has implicit biases of all sorts. There are age biases, racial biases, gender biases, weight biases, attractiveness biases, you name it. We all have implicit biases, everyone. Uh, Older people are biased against younger people are biased against older people. Not always, not universally, but some. Uh, you can have a bias against a group you're a part of. Oftentimes, the biases are against groups you're not a part of. Uh, but you can have an implicit bias, a prejudice that you've internalized against your own race, gender, age, whatever. And that in itself is kind of an interesting thing, that you can be biased against yourself in a way. So I encourage you to look at that. But so implicit biases can cause epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice is what happens when implicit biases go unchecked, so that they affect our decision making and who we trust and who we listen to. I mean, implicit biases can have lots of other uh, much more tangible and life or death effects in the world. But epistemic injustice is an effect of implicit biases. And it happens when we trust or distrust people based on implicit biases rather than on how credible they actually are. So, for example, this is an example I'm taking from the reading. If an all white jury distrusts and ignores the testimony of a black witness because they think, either consciously think if they're like explicitly racist, or unconsciously think if they have an implicit bias, think that black people are less trustworthy or something. That is epistemic injustice. That is not believing a credible person who should be believed simply because of a prejudice against a racial prejudice against them. That's epistemic injustice. Or if male members of a board at a company ignore a female colleague's suggestions because they think, well, women are irrational, she doesn't know what she's talking about. That's epistemic injustice. That is an unfair gender bias, an unjustified prejudice that is causing them not to listen to a colleague who they should be listening to, who deserves to be listened to. That's epistemic injustice. Another case, which is less about sort of racial, gender, age type biases, but it's still epistemic injustice. If you ignore a celebrity's accusers, if people come forward to accuse a celebrity of some sort of criminal or otherwise immoral behavior against them, and you ignore them and assume they're lying because you like the celebrity and on some level don't want to think they're a bad person, so you are more skeptical of their testimony than you would be of people accusing a perfect stranger, someone you've never heard of. If you're more skeptical of accusations against someone you already like, that's epistemic injustice. That's a case of epistemic injustice. The fact that you like someone should not affect how reliable or how trustworthy accusers against that person are. I think this happened a lot with, especially in sort of the first round of accusations against Michael Jackson. A lot of people like Michael Jackson's music, and so we're automatically skeptical of people accusing Michael Jackson of wrongdoing. That's epistemic injustice. That's not believing someone because you sort of have a prejudice against anyone who says negative about this person or the celebrity that you like. That's epistemic injustice. They deserve to be listened to as much as they would be if they were accusing someone you didn't like. So ignoring people and distrusting their claims based on prejudice or liking someone that they're saying negative things about, that's all epistemic injustice. That's wronging these people who you're distrusting and whose claims and statements you're ignoring. for unjustified reasons, for reasons that they don't deserve to be ignored for. And so there are two kinds of epistemic injustice. There's testimonial injustice, which is what happens when someone's credible statements are distrusted or ignored due to prejudice. That's the examples we've been looking at, are all testimonial injustice. So that includes testimonial quieting, which is where someone's testimony is ignored or rejected. And I don't just mean testimony in a court of law, by the way. I mean testimony in the sense of just someone making claims about what's true. They're making claims and their claims are being ignored or rejected due to unjustified prejudices. That's testimonial quieting. But testimonial injustice also includes smothering or testimonial smothering, which is when someone silences themselves and doesn't speak up or doesn't say as much as they would otherwise say because they know that they'll be ignored on the basis of unjustified prejudices. And that's also injustice. When you get to the point where you're silencing yourself because you know people will ignore you based on nothing but prejudice, then you are not being ignored per se, but you are still the victim of epistemic injustice in that case. Another sort of epistemic injustice is hermeneutical injustice, which happens not in any individual, but sort of in society as a whole. Hermeneutical injustice happens when we lack the concepts or terms to understand and communicate someone's experience. So, for example, sexual harassment has existed for millennia, but we've only had the term and concept sexual harassment for a few decades. Before that, victims of sexual harassment suffered, being sexually harassed without the society they lived in having sort of the conceptual tools to say what it is and to complain about it and to recognize it as wrong and whatnot. It was sort of viewed as like flirting in kind of a gross way for a long time. And without the sort of concept to identify it and pick it out and talk about it, people who are being sexually harassed didn't have the tools to talk about their experience and to try to make changes about it. And so that's a sort of hermeneutical injustice. Society does not have or provide the concepts and terms needed to talk about the people's experiences and to talk about these problems so that they can start to be fixed. Other examples of hermeneutical injustice, viewing postpartum depression as just like a personal failing or as just, I think the phrase baby blues was a phrase, as not a medical diagnosable medical condition, but just someone needing to cheer up. Like that's not having the concept of postpartum depression was not like the personal failing of people who were ignorant and didn't know about it, but it caused hermeneutical injustice because we didn't have the tools, the conceptual tools to talk about it as a legitimate medical problem warranting treatment and warranting, being handled as an understandable medical problem rather than some sort of personal failing and needing to cheer up or whatever. Another example is the sort of Victorian era hysteria diagnosis. Women who, couldn't vote and had terrible husbands and had, like 8 children in a year and 6 of them died would be sad and cry. And they'd be like, her brain's broken. She must have hysteria. Like, give her mercury. Or what, like, it was terrible. And that's a sort of hermeneutical injustice. That's not having the conceptual and terminological tools to talk about their experiences and how terrible they were. And it was as a result, the options were either you're happy or your brain is broken. And that's bad. There are lots of options besides happy and brain broken. So that was a sort of hermeneutical injustice that occurred due to a lack of the sort of conceptual tools to talk about people's experiences. So epistemic injustice is a moral problem because it negatively affects other people, but it's not just a moral problem. So, like a defendant who is wrongly distrusted by a jury might end up in prison for a crime they didn't commit. And that is scary. It happens in real life. It's not hypothetical, but that happens. And that's a moral problem. That's because of prejudices, maybe explicit prejudices, but maybe also implicit biases. Someone ended up in prison for a crime they didn't commit because people on the jury had unchecked biases against them. And so that's a moral problem. You can wrong people and cause bad things to happen to them via implicit biases when you commit epistemic injustice. But it's also an epistemic problem, and it can lead to problems for you. If you commit epistemic injustice, you can be led to have false beliefs. Wrongfully ignoring a board member may have pretty dire consequences for a company if the ignored board member has important knowledge that's relevant to the company's decision making. I've read of multiple cases where a company was trying to make decisions about marketing to young people, and a young person on the board says this idea is bad and will not work well. We should not do this. And older members on the board ignore them because they're young and they think that the young member doesn't have experience. And of course, the marketing campaign goes terribly because the young person was right about what appeals to young people. This person with knowledge about what will and won't work in trying to appeal to young people is ignored due to their age, due to their youth, because it's assumed that a young person is too inexperienced to have valuable information to offer. And that is an epistemic injustice. That is ignoring someone's valuable testimony based on a bias, based on age, based on an ageist prejudice. That's bad. And that has negative impacts for the company that does that. The companies lose, sometimes millions of dollars on a failed marketing campaign. That's a problem. And so it's in the company's best interest not to do this, not to have, people committing epistemic injustice against each other. You want to listen to people and hear what they have to say, and ignoring it for unjustified reasons like their race or gender or age or whatever is a bad idea that will lead you to ignore information that might be useful and important. So it's in your best interest to avoid epistemic injustice. We should prevent epistemic injustice for moral reasons, certainly, because we wrong other people and can cause bad things to happen to other people. But we should also try to prevent epistemic injustice for self-interested reasons. For purely selfish reasons, we want to avoid this because when we commit epistemic injustice, our own prejudices that we're not even aware of prevent us from getting the information that we need. And so if we want to have true beliefs and we want to have access to the information that we need to prevent epistemic injustice, avoid committing epistemic injustices, and try to recognize and overcome the biases that lead to epistemic injustice. We want to overcome our own implicit and explicit biases that may be influencing who we believe and what decisions we make based on those beliefs. This is difficult to do, but it's an important tool that benefits both other people and ourselves. So I encourage you to look at the implicit attitude test that I gave the link to earlier. Take one or two of the tests, see what it says. You might be surprised. You might be pleasantly surprised, you might be unpleasantly surprised. But it's worth finding out if you have prejudice, implicit biases, and what implicit biases you might have, so that you can work to correct them and to prevent them from causing you to make mistakes that will negatively impact both other people and yourself. So that's all I want to talk about this week. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to let me know. I will be as helpful as I possibly can. Otherwise, I will see you in the video next week.